This industrial estate stands on what used to be RAF Macmerry's technical site, where all the station's workshops and hangars were based. During the Second World War, this area would have looked very similar to the technical site at the Museum of Flight, as all RAF buildings were built to the same design. But Macmerry had only one aircraft hangar and was a much smaller station than either East Fortune or Drem. In fact, it was a satellite airfield for both of these. Planes and crew would be sent here if there was not enough space for them at the other airfields in East Lothian. But Macmerry was not to play second fiddle to either Drem or East Fortune. It has a few tales of its own to tell. The story of flying here begins at the same time as Drem, in 1916, when 77 Squadron from Edinburgh used it as a home defence landing ground. The same squadron also used Drem, and though it may seem odd to have two landing grounds only 6 miles apart, remember that in 1916 aircraft were pretty new machines and not the most reliable. Better safe than sorry was the motto of the day, and so a field about a mile south of here was chosen as a landing strip. Perhaps as many as 100 men camped out there, and although most of the camp has long since been ploughed over, you can still see the odd sentry box and concrete plinth through the trees at Hodges Farm. When the threat of Zeppelin raids disappeared in 1918, the airfield followed suit. At the end of the 1920s, when flying was becoming a fashionable pastime for the wealthy, the Edinburgh Flying Club decided to establish its home here at Macmerry. Instead of using the World War I airfield, though, they decided to set up camp on the other side of the main road. If you look towards the Forth, you will see the new A1 road cutting through the former landing strip. By 1934, flying was becoming more accessible to the average person on the street, and Scottish Motor Traction, SMT, had great plans for the site's future as an airport. There was already an airport at Turnhouse in Edinburgh, though, and as you shall see, Macmerry was not to be Scotland's answer to Heathrow. Today, SMT are better known for their buses rather than any futuristic airport design. You can draw your own conclusions from that. Nevertheless, North Eastern Airways did use Macmerry as an airfield from 1936 to 1939, and in January of 1941 the airfield was taken over by the RAF. One of the first squadrons Macmerry was to see was 614 Army Cooperation Squadron from the county of Glamorgan in Wales. Squadron Armourer Ron Hann was one of the first to arrive here.
I first arrived at Macmerry in the first week of March as a member of 614 Squadron of the Royal Auxiliary Air Force. It was bitterly cold, there was snow on the ground. The first impression of Macmerry was not a very favourable one, as there was not a thing to be seen on the airfield apart from a small hangar, which was just large enough for a light aircraft, a flying control building, and a rather dilapidated looking windsock. Having surveyed the airfield, we went back to Tranent, to the police station, where the whole squadron assembled outside in the main street, and the police organised civilian billets for us because there was no other accommodation available. I and another airman went to Mrs. Bell in King's Road. It was a miner and his wife, and that's where we were billeted for the first couple of months. We were made very comfortable there. In fact, I mean, it was just like being at home. The landlady was very good to us, and she fed us for the first few days until the squadron organised dining room facilities in the Catholic Hall on the main street. We were in these civilian billets for about approximately 2 months, by which time accommodation was provided for us in the public school in Tranent, in Church Street, Tranent. It was certainly big enough to accommodate the members of the squadron, but it wasn't a terribly comfortable place to stay, particularly after being used to living in private houses for a couple of months. However, we were in there for about another couple of months. It would be about June by the time that accommodation was available at the airfield. During the time we were in Tranent, in this temporary accommodation, the various tradesmen had been hard at work at Macmerry Airfield preparing the accommodation for us. So it was round about the end of May or early June, I think it was, when the whole squadron moved out to the airfield, which of course was quite a big step, because it meant we no longer had to travel the road every day between Tranent and Macmerry Airfield. My job, I was an armourer, which involved working with any sort of armament, bombs, ammunition, and all that sort of thing. There were two armouries, a squadron armoury located on the airfield, plus the station armoury, which was located on the other side of the road, which is now part of the industrial estate. My job really involved various sorts of activities associated with providing the aircraft and any of the personnel with arms of any sort, small arms, ammunition, bombs, and all that sort of thing. A typical day, Reveille was round about 6 o'clock in the morning. Having had a wash in the nearby wash house, which was known as the ablutions, we went to the airman's mess, had our breakfast, and then proceeded to our place of work, which for me, of course, is one of the two armouries, depending on what the particular job had to be done that day. I was usually finished about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, unless I was on night duty of some sort as well. The night duty usually consisted either of guard or fire picket, or if one was an NCO or a junior NCO, you could be the orderly NCO for that particular day. So roughly about once a month, I should say, I was on some sort of all-night duty in addition to my normal duties, which meant that if you were on a night duty which didn't involve much sleep, it didn't make any difference, and next day you still had to be at your work, whether you were half asleep or not. When we first got to Macmerry, we had these Western Lysander aircraft, which of course are comparatively small aircraft. At that time, there was still a fair amount of worry about a possible attempted German invasion of the East Coast. So the main activities of the squadron when we first went there with the Lysander aircraft was to patrol the east coast of Scotland, right from the Berwick-on-Tweed estuary right the way up to the north of Scotland, the Moray Firth and all that area. There was a fairly large stock of liquid mustard gas kept at Macmerry Airfield. The operational idea was, in the event of a German invasion of any particular part of the coast, the Lysander aircraft were to pre-contaminate the landing area, the beaches and that, with this liquid mustard gas, which was so lethal it would burn through practically any material, which meant that any troops landing, wading through onto the beaches and that, they'd immediately become contaminated casualties. It really was lethal stuff. I think the only thing it probably wouldn't burn through would be lead, but it certainly would burn through any sort of rubber, leather, footwear, anything like that. But fortunately, the occasion never arose when the squadron had to arm the Lysander aircraft with the gas cylinders. But from time to time, there were practice runs carried out with a harmless fluid, a harmless liquid, used on the same cylinders, on the same aircraft, except this stuff was quite harmless on anyone it happened to fall on. The only thing was it smelt very strongly of aniseed, which attracted dogs, and we always found that any time personnel had been handling this stuff, this aniseed smell got on our clothes, and as soon as any dogs got anywhere around, they immediately came, attracted by the smell.
By the summer of 1942, Macmerry looked something like an RAF station. Hangars and workshops had been built here, and on the other side of the road, dispersal pens and shelters on the edge of the airfield protected planes and men against enemy attack. Some of these are still standing. You may have seen them beside the roundabout on your way here. Proper accommodation for airfield staff was ready by 1942, ranging from a private villa for the station commander to wooden and Nissen huts for the troops of Army Cooperation units who had joined 614 Squadron here. The accommodation site was up on the hill at Penston Farm behind the workshops and was only a 5-minute walk away. Facilities for the airmen and women were excellent. The food was far better than civilian rations, and it was free. The canteen was famed for its fried breakfasts, but Macmerry was no place for slobs. If the drills and marches were not enough exercise for the men here, they could always use the squash court or gymnasium. Not many people did, though. To play squash after a day's work was a clear signal to officers that the routine was not vigorous enough. In early 1943, the RAF established a regiment training school at Macmerry. By this time, there were around 600 RAF stations in the UK, and although the threat of German attack had all but diminished in East Lothian, airfields around the country still had to be defended. Macmerry provided training for the RAF regiments, and the routine was pretty gruelling. A regular exercise was to take troops by truck into the Lammermuir Hills with backpacks as heavy as 100 pounds. The men then had to make their way back here in the shortest time possible, and although the exercises were supposed to be tests of navigation and fitness, any motor transport was fair game. Buses, trucks, and even trains were persuaded to carry troops back to base to save the men the time and effort of walking the long roads home. Of course, nobody wanted to come last, or fall out of exercises. That often meant being posted away to other units where faces were new and the process of finding new friends had to start again. Some RAF regiments were involved in more than long marches and fitness training. In the winter of 1943 and spring of 1944, plans were well underway to invade France by the beaches of Normandy. It was hugely important that German forces were not sent to Normandy from other captured areas, and a scheme was needed to fool the Germans into thinking that the Allies were to invade some other region. As Scotland lies fairly close to Norway, it was decided that efforts should be made to make it look as if British forces were gathering on the Scottish coast to attack the Germans in Norway. 3 RAF regiment squadrons, numbers 2737, 2830 and 2949, were sent here in the winter of 1943 as an essential part of this scheme, codenamed Operation Fortitude North. Men from these units were sent up from Macmerry to the Cairngorm Mountains for winter training. Radio calls were sent out to make it look like there were thousands of men training for these exercises instead of the couple of hundred really taking part. Ships began to gather in the Forth Estuary, and by May, 71 boats were anchored waiting to be photographed by German reconnaissance planes, and the anti-aircraft gunners on the ground were told not to shoot them down. To German intelligence, it must have appeared that Norway was to be invaded in the summer of 1944, and so no enemy forces were sent down to the beaches of Normandy, helping the Allies invade and liberate France on June the 6th. RAF regiment member turned local historian Jack Tully Jackson tells of his time at Macmerry.
We were shunted up to Macmerry, RAF Macmerry, back in 843. We were put on a train at Peterborough, and eventually the train stopped at a place called Longnidry. They said, you can get out here, and they said, your camp is just around the corner, under the bridge and up the road. And we discovered that there was snow on the road. We had actually 18 inches of snow. Around the corner turned out to be Penston Farm, which is about 2 miles up the road. Arrived there in the morning in cold billets, cold beds. However, that was only the beginning of things. Life changed dramatically after that, as far as we are concerned, because we had been on radar stations mainly in the south of England. But they told us that we were going to be part of an RAF element of deception unit to be based at Macmerry, to be working with Norwegians with a possible invasion of Norway. That was the story we were given. They equipped us with all sorts of mountaineering equipment, ski caps, snowshoes, windproofs. The worrying thing was that they gave us string vests to wear. None of us ever had heard of a string vest up to this point. But apparently the idea was to trap heat between your skin and your outer clothing. They were very uncomfortable to wear, especially when you were carrying a Bergen rucksack, which was also new equipment for us, and sleeping bags. And all this totaled up to almost £100 by the time you got all your ammunition. And depending on what you were equipped with, some people had Bren guns and some people were carrying 2-inch mortars. And it was a horrific weight to carry. We started off around about, I suppose in the squadron there probably was about 120. Very soon that was reduced down to about 70 because a lot of them just couldn't take it. And they kept dropping off and got posted away. However, those who survived were very, very fit at the end of the day. Eventually, they decided it was time that we went into the mountains, so we were put aboard a convoy of American Chevs, big trucks, driven by black Americans, and set off up the Cairngorms into even deeper snow. Our first experience was at a place called WWII. Went off the road at WWII and crossed into the Cairngorms there. And we exercised there for best part of a week, I think it was initially, with Norwegian troops and some Scottish troops as well. We were part of the 52nd Lowland Division, but we hardly seen anybody because we were put up on a mountainside and dug into snow pits and had to survive in there for, say, the best part of a week out of your Bergen rucksack, which was very limited in what you could actually. It was all compo rations, tins of this and tins of that, tins of the other. Pretty monotonous stuff, but you had to get used to it. The aggravating thing was that we were in sight of and smell of the WWII distillery, which we were getting whiffs of the malt from there. We also, of course, and I said, slept there with Lammermoors, but Lammermoors was another site closer to our camp that exercised a lot there. What actually happened was they would put you into at night, they'd put you into a 1500 wit, close it up, give you a map, its compass and a torch, set you off in threes. You get dumped out into the way down in the Cheviot sometimes, way down south, down Lauder area, even further south than that, and told to make your way back to Macmerry as best you could. There were so many other things. We were training with, I said, live ammunition most of the time. Some of the exercises out of Macmerry, we had to march to Dunbar, Hedwick range there, fire so many live rounds there, and back to Macmerry. And I think the time allowed was something like 4 hours to get to Hedwick Hill and back to Macmerry. And if you could survive that, you were fit for anything. Well, we had some very good memories of Macmerry, especially on the social side, because we got out of camp most nights when we were back at base, that is, but we were away quite a lot into the Cairngorms. And when we got back to base, we were allowed out to Edinburgh because we only got paid once a fortnight, so therefore we couldn't afford to go very often. You had to get we usually had used a lift either by a truck, a Liberty truck going in was provided, but you had to be ready for to come back on this Liberty truck. If you weren't going to come back on the Liberty truck, you had to book yourself accommodation in Edinburgh, which in our case was the YMCA in St Andrews Street, or South St Andrews Street, I think it is. That's where it was, and that's the first thing you done was to go and book a bed in there. But our bunk beds, and it was quite comfortable, quite much better than the billet anyway. See, our billets were very, very, very basic. And the snow in the winter time would blow in, and it was really freezing. Although there was a coke fire in the centre of the billet, nearly everybody tried to crowd round this thing, and there was always somebody outside who was frozen. You know, it wasn't all. Although being young, it didn't matter that much. You know, apart from the wettings, sometimes the wettings were kind of tough to deal with. We had to go run through the rivers and your full equipment, and getting dried out from that wasn't always very easy.
Although small in size, Macmerry was a very lively station and a hive of activity. From 1943 to 1944, Cunliffe Owen Limited ran a factory repairing Lockheed Hudson aircraft for the American Air Force who were stationed here. The factory was on the east side of the airfield, where Gladsmuir Industrial Estate is now, near the karting centre you passed on your way here. Workers were mainly women from around East Lothian, which must have pleased the airmen stationed here. In fact, the men never had any trouble finding local partners. Girls from Macmerry and Tranent loved the excitement and the uniforms the airmen brought to what had been a quiet mining area. In April of 1945, the Royal Navy took control of Macmerry and continued to use it as a satellite station for DREM. HMS Nighthawk II, as the station was now called, was handed back to the RAF at the start of 1946. Later that year, the Edinburgh Flying Club once again took over the airfield, but not before part of it had been ploughed up for farming. This reduced the landing area by quite a bit, which in any case had always been quite bumpy and suffered from poor drainage. The Flying Club used the airfield for 7 years until 1953, when it was completely ploughed over. The hangars and workshops were taken over by various companies, and Macmerry Industrial Estate was born. This was typical of many airfield technical sites up and down the country. Ready-made RAF workshops were popular with small engineering and construction companies working hard to rebuild Britain's economy after 6 years of expensive war. Unlike the isolated rural workshops at Drem and East Fortune, the technical site here lay right on the A1, which cut between the hangars and the airfield. This was an ideal location for transporting products throughout East Lothian and the UK, so it is no surprise that the industrial estate flourished. Although only the station armoury, now Hab Fab Steel Fabricators, remains, it is not difficult to imagine the scurry of engineers and mechanics at RAF Macmerry 60 years ago.